Hello, and welcome to the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley. My name is Nancy Huth, and I'm the Deputy Director for Arts and Education. I'll be joined in a little bit by my colleague, Mary Ladrick, who's our Director of Education. But first, for those of you who may not be familiar with us, let me tell you a little bit about the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley. It was founded in 1997 as the Glen Burnie House and Gardens, and in 2005, the museum was expanded with a large building designed by Michael Graves, housing our galleries and administrative offices, as well as collection storage. The gardens on the property feature 7 acres of formal gardens, and they surround the Glen Burnie House. The central portion of the Glen Burnie House was built in the 1790s. The gardens were designed by our benefactor, Julian Woodglass Jr., and his partner, Arlie Taylor. This past November, we opened the trails at the MSV. This includes 3 miles of walking trails interspersed with sculpture and landscape feature installations. The trails are open free from 7 to dusk every day, so we hope someday you'll be able to join us out on the trails. In addition to the trails and the gardens in the Glen Burnie House, as well as the museum building, the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley features several different collections, including the Shenandoah Valley Collection of decorative arts, paintings, and other objects, including a large archival collection, the Julian Woodglass Jr. Collection of paintings and decorative arts, and the Arlie Taylor Miniatures Collection. In addition to the collections, here at the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley, we also offer a full schedule of changing exhibitions. Our mission is to preserve and enrich the cultural life and heritage of the Valley, and our changing exhibition schedule works with the enrich part. So having said all that, I'd now like to introduce you to our current exhibition, Norman Rockwell's America. The exhibition comes to us from the National Museum of American Illustration in Newport, Rhode Island, and the American Illustrators Gallery in New York City. They were the curators and organizers of the exhibition. The exhibition includes 27 paintings, 3 drawings, 6 posters, and 323 Saturday evening post covers, some of which are behind me now. The exhibition provides a really nice overview of the work of the American illustrator Norman Rockwell, one of the most beloved artists of the 20th century. He was born in 1894 in New York City, but even as a teenager, he began to study art and work professionally as an artist. At the age of 14, he enrolled in his first art classes, and 2 years later, he left high school to enroll at the National Academy of Design and the Art Students League, where he trained as an illustrator. While still a teenager, he became the art director for Boys Life magazine, the magazine of the Boy Scouts of America. At the young age of 22, he had his very first Saturday evening post cover, and it's over my right shoulder up here in the corner. So in 1916, he went to the offices of the Post in Philadelphia and he presented some paintings to them, and they chose 2 of them. He would go on to have a very long career working as an artist for the Saturday Evening Post. Now, this is a magazine we're not too familiar with today, but in its heyday, the Post had millions of subscribers and reached homes across the country. It featured literature, news items, poetry, illustration, and it was broadly read by the American public. So Norman Rockwell knew that getting your picture on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post would allow your work to reach millions of Americans. And with that, I think I will move on and concentrate on one of the paintings he did for one of his Saturday Evening Post covers. Moving into the 19-teens and the 1920s, Rockwell became a regular illustrator for the Saturday Evening Post. At the same time, he was also doing illustrations and covers for other magazines, including the humor magazine Judge, the farming magazine Country Gentleman, and Life magazine, among others. So let's start by looking at this painting. What are some of the things that you notice? We're just going to take a few seconds to look at it. So you might have noticed sort of a white halo around the sitter's head. You probably noticed his tongue sticking out and the fact that he appears to be concentrating while he threads that needle. You might have noticed the sewing box at his feet, the pincushion behind him, the cat. Cats and sewing boxes are not necessarily a good mix, but there you have it. You might have noticed the hole in his sock or his slippers. This painting is called, obviously enough, Threading the Needle, and it's very typical of Rockwell's early Saturday Evening Post compositions. It features a single figure against a white background and the two black lines of the magazine's masthead. Now, Rockwell knew that the job of the cover was to sell magazines, and so for him, that meant the cover had to, in his words, quote, tell the whole story with a single image. And Rockwell's post covers and much of his work really do tell stories. Rockwell traveled a great deal, and on his travels, he became convinced that people were similar in their joys and challenges all over the world. So for this cover image, he focuses on the bachelor trying to thread a needle so he can mend the hole in his sock. At the time he painted this, Rockwell was living in New Rochelle, New York. His model was a man named Dave Campion, who also lived in New Rochelle, but he owned a stationery shop, sort of a newsstand, almost like the Handy Mart of its day, in the adjacent town of Pelham, Pelham, New York. And that store was kind of a community gathering place. Campion was tall and lanky, and he served as Rockwell's model on many occasions. Rockwell disliked professional models, and he rarely used them. Instead, he turned to friends and family and neighbors, whom he did pay for their modeling services. Prior to 1926, and this one is from 1922, Saturday Evening Post covers were printed in duotone, meaning they were printed in shades and tints of black and red. So Rockwell's painting is in full color, and there's some subtle differences between the greenish color of the man's waistcoat and the sort of more brownish olive hue of his pants. But as printed on the cover, however, these all appear more gray. And Threading the Needle was on the cover of the April 8th, 1922 Saturday Evening Post. The painting is done in oil on canvas, and the cover, of course, is printed on paper. And now I will turn it over to my colleague Mary Ladrick to talk about another painting in this exhibition.
Hi, I'm Mary Ladrick, Director of Education at the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley, and I'm going to be sharing some of my favorite pictures in this show with you today. I wanted to start with this one, and I will give you just a minute to take a good look at it and see what you notice. So in this picture, we have a young lady who is dressed in her finest. She's front and center in full light, and in the background, perhaps you've noticed there's a globe. There are several adults sitting behind her, and if you notice down at the bottom, she's standing on a stage decorated with some bunting, and there's a bunch of flowers here. So perhaps you have deduced that this is a special day at school for this young lady, and this picture is called Young Valedictorian. Rockwell painted it in 1922, and one of the things that our guests the other night at our members preview noticed about this picture is the striking lighting that Rockwell uses in this picture. He's got the strong light coming from above and spotlighting our young valedictorian. Lots of different shading in the background helps her to really pop to the front of this picture. And this chiaroscuro that Rockwell uses, this dramatic change of light and dark, this is something that painters have been using for probably thousands of years, but most notably the Dutch painters from the Dutch Golden Age. And Rembrandt was forefront in that Rockwell really admired Rembrandt. He was one of the artists that he tried to emulate in his own paintings. Rockwell always considered himself an illustrator, not a fine artist, but you can see in this painting that he definitely had the skill to have been considered a fine artist. Interestingly about this painting, this one was never used as a cover for a magazine, but it's definitely one of my favorites in the show.
Norman Rockwell was trained to paint from life, but in the 1930s he began to use photography as a tool. So the wall of paintings and drawings behind me gives us a good opportunity to talk about Rockwell's technique. So to my right is a large-scale finished drawing. And this is the kind of thing that Rockwell would create and become kind of the basis for our work. A Saturday Evening Post cover started with an idea. And so the post covers were not typically dictated by the editor or the art editor. Instead, Rockwell would kind of shut himself up in his studio for a couple of days and generate an idea that he felt was really worthy of the cover. Then he'd make a rough sketch of it, and he would take that sketch to the art editor's office at the Post. Sometimes he'd take a couple of sketches. He would present his sketches, he'd act it out if necessary, because they were pretty rough sketches, and once the sketch or the idea was approved, then the work began. Now, not all artists could get approval from their rough sketches, but by the time Rockwell painted this, did this drawing in the early 40s, he was a really established artist. He was actually pretty established by the 20s with the Post. So he'd have his idea, and then he would start to look for like the ingredients. So he would grab his sketching materials as well as a photographer. He worked with a variety of professional photographers, and he would go out in search of props, models, all the elements that he'd need, the setting, everything that he was going to need for the painting. He would make sketches while the photographer would take photographs, and he would direct those photographs. So the photographer would take photographs from several angles of a building, say, or in this case, probably the church pews. He would take several photographs of the models, and Rockwell would coach them in what he wanted their expressions to look like and what he wanted their postures to be like. And photography gave him the opportunity to capture a fleeting expression in a more permanent way. So once he had all this material, he had all his photographs, the photographer would print them for him, Rockwell would lay them out on his studio floor and select the ones he wanted to use. And he's using different elements from different photographs. Then he would take a large piece of architect's paper and he would affix it to a vertical easel, and he would take his little sketch and project that onto this vertical paper in the size that he wanted. And the projector was like an opaque projector. He used something called a bolopticon. He would project the image onto the canvas in the size that he wanted and begin to draw lightly. Then he would take the photographs and put those in the opaque projector and position different photographs for different elements as he needed them and draw over those. And in this way, he would start to work up a large-scale composition, which ultimately ended up being a very finished drawing. He would even work out where he wanted the word post to go. And once he's worked up this finished drawing, these are in charcoal on paper, once he's worked this up, he's pretty much determined what that cover is going to look like. Next, he would take this large-scale drawing and trace it onto another large-scale piece of paper, of tracing paper. And this is something that illustrators and commercial artists probably still do. Years ago when I took an illustration class, we used techniques like this. Lots of tracing paper, lots of drawing. He would take that tracing of his drawing, attach that to the canvas, and put a piece of transfer paper underneath it. It's the idea like carbon paper, but not exactly, not so smudgy. And then he would trace over the tracing and transfer all the major lines of the drawing to his canvas in the same size. So he's going to be working on a painting that's the same size as this drawing. Once he's got all those lines on his canvas, then he can start actually painting. So he's got his finished drawing, he's got his photo reference materials, he's got his sketches, he's surrounded by all this reference material, all this data as he called it. And then he begins to paint. So he starts by doing a monochromatic underpainting, usually in like raw umber or some color like that, which he has thinned with turpentine. Then he begins to block in his colors. Sometimes he worked in thin glazes, that's oil paint thinned with linseed oil, or sometimes he would work with the paint right out of the tube. He liked Winsor & Newton oil paints, so that's what he typically used. He tended to work on the canvas all over, though sometimes he would do the head first. He said that he did the part first that seemed the most important to him. And then he'd finish up the painting. For him, completing the painting, he said, was the easy part. It was relatively straightforward. Now, With a composition that was moving along very smoothly, this process could last as little as a week. Some paintings took him months. While he's doing these drawings, he's also thinking about the color scheme. So we're going to move down the wall a little bit and look at some of the oil sketches that he produced as part of this preparatory process. Now, before he starts working on the actual final painting, there's another step that Rockwell employed, and that is working out the color scheme. And to do this, he actually made pretty small images. Sometimes those color sketches, like the one on my left, were done on photo paper. So sometimes he would have his photographer take a photograph of his finished sketch, print it on a matte photo paper, affix that to board, and then he would paint right on top of the photo paper, which is the case in this picture behind me of the charwomen. These are cleaning ladies in a theater. Sometimes he would just do the oil sketch just on some kind of other surface like board or even paper. And that's the case in the one on my right, the breakfast table political argument study. And the purpose of these sketches is just to work out the color scheme, work out the palette. Sometimes he would make several. He would sometimes show them to family and friends. He would show his final drawings to family and friends and get some feedback. So that's why these pictures on either side of me here look rather unfinished, because they really are studies. They're just oil studies to work out the color scheme. Now, this is an example of a finished painting that became a design for a cover of the Saturday Evening Post in 1948. And as you can see, it's about the same size as the drawing we were looking at a few minutes ago. When Rockwell did his paintings, as I mentioned, he would sometimes build up layers of paint using glazes or using thick, opaque paint right from the tube. Sometimes he would put layers of thinned varnish between his layers of paint, and what this allowed him to do was rub out a whole section without destroying the layer of paint beneath. But unfortunately, it makes his paintings kind of unstable. And if you look closely at some of them, this one appears to be in really great shape. But sometimes his paintings have a little crackling on the surface because different layers are drying at different speeds. A lot of illustrators did this. Maxfield Parrish was one who did this as well. So it was a pretty typical technique for an illustrator. And Norman Rockwell does not seem to have been terribly concerned about the fact that his paintings might last for hundreds of years after him. He actually said something like, "Let the next generation paint their own pictures." So anyway, this would be the kind of finished painting that he would frame and deliver to the Post. Usually he took them himself, but sometimes other people would take them, and he would almost always frame them because he wanted the picture to be presented properly. I do not know if this is his original frame. I suspect it is not, but he liked to he liked to present his pictures in a very finished way.
Here's another great picture in this show. Take a minute to give it a good look. See what you notice about it. Be sure you take a look at the expressions on our subjects' faces. So in this picture, it's called Volunteer Fireman. We have our volunteer fireman who's got a look of determination on his face. He's being assisted by this youth at his side whose expression is pure joy at the excitement of attending to the fire that they're racing to. And of course, what fireman is complete without his faithful companion, this great dog who is all in motion as they race to the scene of the fire. One of the great things about this picture is the way that Rockwell has used the lighting that touches every aspect of the front of the subjects as they race towards the fire. This picture, when you look around the gallery, stands out. It's very different from most of Rockwell's covers. And that is because he used a technique called dynamic symmetry for the composition and layout of this picture. Dynamic symmetry is a technique that artists have been using for thousands of years, which involves laying out your composition on a grid of horizontal and perpendicular lines. And this is useful not just for composition, but also for perspective. Rockwell used it once for this picture and decided that it was too much work and it didn't really jibe with his style, which I really appreciate that he tried it, didn't like it, and moved on to doing what he did best. But when you look at this picture, what's great about it is everything is in motion, and he shows you so clearly that they're rushing to the scene of this fire. If you notice our lad here, his breeches aren't buckled and his shoelaces are untied, and our gentleman is obviously wearing his house shoes as they run to the fire. Really charming picture, and just a great exhibit of Rockwell's skills.
So let's take a closer look at this picture, which is one of the posters in the exhibition. What are some of the things that you notice here? So you might have noticed people looking out at you. You might have noticed the white dinnerware or the glasses of water. You probably noticed that great big turkey, maybe even in front of it the celery, the bowl of fruit, something that looks maybe like jellied cranberry sauce or some kind of aspic. It's often been described as Jell-O. The salt and pepper shakers that appear to be silver. Maybe a sense of anticipation, the smiles all around. This is one of 4 images that Rockwell did called the 4 Freedoms. They're probably among his most famous works. He was inspired by a 1941 speech by President Franklin Roosevelt, in which Roosevelt listed what he called the 4 freedoms that every person must have, as he said, everywhere in the world. In his January 6, 1941 address to Congress, Roosevelt said, quote, "In the future days, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms. The third of which," he said, "was freedom from want, which, translated into world terms, means economic understandings that will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world." One scholar compared this image to a Dutch still life painting. Although it's meant to depict the notion of freedom from want, it's actually relatively Spartan. There's no wine, there's no bread, only the things that we've talked about. The 4 paintings of the 4 freedoms are now in the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. But after Rockwell completed them, they traveled to 16 cities and helped raise $132 million for war bonds in exhibitions that were sponsored by the U.S. Treasury and the Saturday Evening Post. Now, these paintings took Rockwell 7 months to complete, beginning in the summer of 1942. They were first reproduced in 4 consecutive issues inside the Saturday Evening Post in 1943 with essays by contemporary writers, and they prompted millions of requests for reprints. Now, some versions of the 4 Freedoms story show Rockwell first taking the idea to the U.S. government, who turned him down. Thus, he went to the Post to present his idea. But for Rockwell, the project was paramount. In a note to himself, he wrote that the 4 freedoms, quote, "mean everything to me." He was obsessed with this project, and he tried to clear his calendar so he could complete it. But he was behind deadline on the works, and he actually wanted to redo Freedom from Want because he was concerned that it didn't reflect the contents of the accompanying essay by a Filipino immigrant, novelist, and labor organizer named Carlos Bulosan that mentioned the mistreatment of Asian immigrants to the West Coast. But the Post's editor, who at the time was a man named Ben Hibbs, begged Rockwell to finish the painting, stressing that it didn't need to match the contents of the essay, only the theme. Eventually, Rockwell finished all 4 paintings by the end of the year, and the first one was published in the Post on February 20th in 1943. That same weekend, the Office of War Information announced plans to issue millions of posters reproducing the series. Freedom from Want appeared in the March 16, 1943 issue of the Post. March 6th issue of the Post. Now, the models for the painting were his Arlington friends and neighbors, as well as family members, and they were all photographed separately in his studio, so they never all sat together around this table, even though there is a funny little newsreel that exists from the 1940s showing them gathered as if they did. They did not. The sitters include Rockwell's wife, Mary, the woman with sort of reddish curly hair on the left, his mother, Nancy, across from Mary, the white-haired woman who's smiling. In the lower right is Rockwell's neighbor, Jim Martin, who's looking out at us. And this is a device that had been used by artists since the Renaissance as a way to pull our eyes into the picture. Now, Rockwell was concerned that the canvas had come off as kind of smug, especially to Europeans who were much closer to the battlegrounds and were suffering from the hardships of war much more than Americans were at the time. He was afraid that the feast being presented flaunted abundance in the face of those who were less fortunate. But his editor convinced him to go ahead with it, and it became one of his most famous paintings. That same year, in 1943, Rockwell's studio, which was now in Arlington, Vermont, was destroyed by a fire. It burned all his reference materials, all his props, costumes, books, art supplies, everything that was in there. Some authors have said this began a second phase of his work in which he focused a lot more on contemporary people and situations rather than on historical ones, which had been a mainstay of his work up until this time.
I thought it would be great to share some more of the Saturday Evening Post covers with you. And this grouping that I've selected is from 1942 to 1944. So we're right in the middle of World War II. And Rockwell never wanted to dwell on the blood and guts side of the war, for lack of a better expression. And yet he had the ability to do some really, really poignant and moving covers. Anyway, this one from Thanksgiving in particular just kind of goes right to the heart of the American experience during World War II. But all of the other ones, they make you laugh, they make you proud, they definitely built morale during the war years. We've got Rosie the Riveter up here, looking strong and proud. Santa Claus is peeking through the headlines in this one, popping right through to remind us to have a Merry Christmas. Rockwell's beloved character, Willie Gillis, is prominently featured. He's obviously making his way around the world. Down here we have this young lady who is dreaming of Willie Gillis. There are pictures of him on her nightstand and on the wall. So much fun. And here we have a sailor who's getting his latest tattoo of a girl's name on his arm. The ones above have been crossed out by the tattoo artist. So clearly our sailor has a girl in every port. And then down here we have our armchair general who is following the war closely on his radio and tuning in. So this to me just, oh, I left one out. April Fools. Every year Rockwell did an April Fool's cover, and there are many of them featured here in the exhibition. So it just to me goes to the skill of artists, of Rockwell in particular, to engage us and reach all of our emotions.
So this is the last painting I want to take a look at. And once again, let's take a nice close look at this. So spend some time casting your eyes around this picture. What are some of the things that you notice? So you might have noticed this full suit of armor on the back of a model of a horse, also wearing what appears to be a full suit of some kind of embroidered cloth, as well as some armor. You might have noticed that horse's rolling eye. You probably noticed the person in uniform, who appears to be a museum guard, sitting down in the lower right corner doing all kinds of museum no-nos. He is pouring coffee next to art objects. He's got a sandwich or a piece of cake on his lap. He is sitting on the plinth. He's got his lunchbox on it. He's got his apple on it. He has hung his coat over the foot of the armored figure, and from it is hanging some kind of instrument. Maybe it's a kind of hygrothermograph to gauge temperature and humidity. There appears to be a flashlight in his pocket, and he is very calmly pouring his coffee while he's bathed in light. You might have noticed the other suits of armor around him, or the Gothic arch above everybody. There's a pretty serious looking weapon there called a halberd right here. Other weapons around. Norman Rockwell was inspired to make this painting after he visited the Higgins Armory Museum in Worcester, Massachusetts. That collection is now part of the Worcester Art Museum. He went to the museum and he took many, many, many photographs with his photographer. The photos are now in the collection of the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge. This is a painting that he completed for a 1960 Saturday Evening Post cover, one of his later ones. Now, it may not be easy to see in this format, but the surface of this picture is covered with an all-over sort of ripply texture, and it's unlike other pictures in the exhibition. Rockwell liked to play with texture, and one of the things he would do is he would take Benjamin Moore Sani Flat house paint, sort of an eggshell surface. He would pour off the liquid, and he would stir up the paste, and then he would coat his canvases with that thick paste. Then he would do all kinds of things to create a texture on it. And he said that other illustrators did this as well. So you could brush the paste with a paintbrush, you could cover it with wrinkled paper or cloth, and when you removed that, it would leave this texture behind. The problem, he said, is that it took quite a long time to dry. So that's what he did with this picture. So depending on the angle you're looking at it, you can see this all over ripply texture that doesn't have anything to do with the brush strokes. This was done for a 1962 Saturday Evening Post from November 3rd, and that post cover is right here on my right. Thank you so much for joining us today for this quick overview of Norman Rockwell's America. I hope it won't be too long before we'll be able to see you in person here at the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley.